96 houses stood quietly on land that was never supposed to belong to them. Roads were paved, walls were raised, families moved in, and an HOA proudly claimed control over every inch of it. What no one realized was that one document, buried in a courthouse file, told a very different story. I watched as construction finished, rules tightened, and fines were issued on property that wasn't legally theirs. I stayed silent. I waited, because sometimes the most devastating move isn't stopping them early, it's letting them finish first. And when the truth finally came out, everything collapsed at once. Before any lines were crossed or lawyers were involved, life in that neighborhood felt predictable in the way most people hope their lives will be. The community sat just outside a growing suburban corridor, the kind of place developers loved because empty land still surrounded it, and the future always felt one construction project away. Trees lined the roads, the mornings were quiet, and most residents believed they had bought into stability. Rules existed, of course, but they were marketed as protection, not control. The HOA brochures promised order, rising property values, and a sense of shared responsibility. I had owned my land long before any of that existed. Years earlier, I purchased a large, irregularly shaped parcel on the edge of what would later become the development. At the time, it was nothing more than open ground with old survey markers, uneven soil, and the occasional fence line left behind by previous owners. I wasn't in a rush to build. The land was an investment, something meant for the future, not something I needed to touch every day. I paid the taxes, kept records, and let it sit quietly while the city expanded outward. When construction began nearby, it didn't immediately raise alarms. Developments pop up all the time, and it's easy to assume that zoning, surveys, and permits have been handled correctly by professionals. Heavy machinery moved in, roads were carved out, and foundations appeared one by one. From a distance, it looked like any other planned neighborhood taking shape. The HOA formed early, establishing committees, approving designs, and enforcing guidelines before most homes were even finished. Everything appeared orderly, efficient, and confident. As the months passed, the development grew faster than expected. Streets multiplied, houses filled in nearly every open space. Eventually, something about the layout began to feel off. The boundaries didn't align with older maps I remembered. Certain curves in the road cut deeper than they should have. Fences were placed where none had existed before. Still, I didn't intervene. Large projects often look chaotic before they're finished, and assumptions can be dangerous without proof. Meanwhile, the HOA's presence became more visible. Notices went up. Rules expanded. What began as simple guidelines turned into detailed enforcement. Residents were fined for minor violations, warned about landscaping choices, and reminded repeatedly that the HOA had authority over the entire community. The language they used was absolute, leaving no room for doubt or discussion. They spoke as if every square foot of land was unquestionably theirs to regulate. From the outside, the community still looked peaceful. Families moved in. Cars filled the driveways. Lawns were trimmed to perfection. But underneath that calm surface, control was tightening. The HOA's power grew with each completed home, each signed document, each resident who accepted the rules without question. Confidence turned into arrogance, and procedure turned into habit. I noticed that no one ever questioned where the lines truly were. Boundaries were assumed, not verified. The development plans were treated as fact, and the original land records were rarely mentioned. It was easier for everyone to believe the paperwork had already been checked, the math already done. After all, who would allow an entire neighborhood to be built on land that didn't belong to them? That assumption was exactly what allowed everything to continue. While the HOA focused on enforcing compliance and projecting authority, no one thought to look backward. No one revisited old deeds or compared surveys. No one asked uncomfortable questions. And I didn't volunteer answers. I watched the process unfold quietly, aware that something fundamental had been overlooked. The more the neighborhood expanded, the clearer it became that the mistake wasn't small. This wasn't a fence off by a few feet or a driveway crossing a line. Entire streets sat where they shouldn't have. Homes stood on land that had never been transferred, sold, or approved for that purpose. Yet the HOA operated as if ownership was settled and permanent. By the time construction slowed and the final homes were completed, the community felt complete. The HOA was fully active. Rules were enforced without hesitation, and beneath all of it, a silent problem remained, buried under concrete, paperwork, and confidence. What looked like a finished neighborhood was actually balanced on a legal fault line, one that no one realized was about to crack. As the neighborhood settled into what looked like normalcy, the HOA shifted from organizing to asserting. What had once been polite reminders became formal notices. Rules multiplied quietly, then all at once. Landscaping requirements tightened. Parking restrictions appeared overnight. Fines were issued automatically, without warnings, without flexibility. Authority was no longer implied, it was enforced. At first, none of it was directed at me. I wasn't living there, wasn't part of the daily rhythm of the community. That distance made it easier to observe without reacting. But the more aggressively the HOA behaved toward residents, the more confident they became about their reach. Their assumption was simple. The land was theirs, the rules were final, and resistance was pointless. That confidence eventually turned outward. I began receiving official-looking letters claiming that portions of my land fell under HOA jurisdiction. The language was firm, almost rehearsed, as if they had sent versions of the same notice many times before. They referenced development maps, internal surveys, and governing documents, all presented as unquestionable proof. According to them, the land had already been integrated into the neighborhood. My ownership, they implied, was either outdated or irrelevant. There was no accusation at first, just an expectation of compliance, requests to maintain certain areas, notices about approved uses, reminders that any future development would require HOA permission. It was subtle, calculated pressure designed to normalize control before conflict ever started. I didn't respond. That silence seemed to irritate them more than resistance would have. Follow-up letters arrived faster. The tone sharpened. Deadlines appeared. Then came the fines, charges for violations that made no sense on land I had never agreed to regulate under their authority. They fined me for conditions they themselves had created. Roads they paved, structures they approved, utilities they installed. The absurdity was almost impressive. Behind the scenes, I started reviewing records, slowly, methodically. Old deeds, archived surveys, property descriptions that predated the development by decades. The moment the HOA chose to escalate publicly was the moment everything stopped being theoretical. Until then, their power had lived in letters, fines, and quiet intimidation. But once they moved to formal legal action, asserting ownership, jurisdiction, and enforcement rights over land they claimed as indisputably theirs, the conflict reached a point where there could be no retreat. They believed they were cornering a non-compliant landowner. In reality, they were walking straight into the center of their own mistake. When the case moved forward, the atmosphere shifted. This was no longer about fines or rules. It was about ownership, about history, about records that predated the HOA, the developer, and even the city's most recent expansions. Then the original deed was introduced, not summarized, not referenced, physically presented. It traced the land back through decades, untouched by the development's paperwork, untouched by any transfer, sale, or agreement that would have placed it under HOA control. Survey lines from different eras were overlaid. The discrepancy was undeniable. The room changed. What had been confidence turned into confusion. The HOA's argument fractured as questions piled up, questions they had never prepared to answer. The turning point wasn't loud. It didn't come with a dramatic declaration or raised voices. It came in the quiet acknowledgement that the deed was valid, the boundaries were wrong, and the development had proceeded without legal authority over the land it occupied. The HOA had spent its existence asserting control over something it never legally possessed. The aftermath unfolded slowly at first, then all at once. Once the foundation of the HOA's authority collapsed, nothing could be neatly contained. Notices stopped appearing, threats vanished. Residents realized how much control had been exerted without question. Title companies froze transactions. Lenders raised concerns. Insurance carriers requested clarification. The HOA's leadership faced the hardest reckoning. Their authority had not merely been reduced, it had been invalidated.